Author Jeff Apter back for his third appearance on the podcast. He has just released the book, Carl Perkins, The King of Rockabilly. Welcome back, Jeff.
Eric, always a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me back.
We were talking before we started recording this book for you, because I was telling you I didn't know much about Carl Perkins, and you said you didn't know much about him either. This project came to you. Tell me about that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I knew the basics. I knew about the Beatles' relationship. I knew about Blue Suede Shoes. I knew about his relationship with Johnny Cash. I knew about the Rockabilly session. That stuff, which is, the $1 Million Quartet. But really, that was my understanding of Carl Perkins. What happened is that I'd written a book about Keith Urban, which we spoke about a while back, and it was picked up by a US publisher. And typically, the author-publisher relationship, there's a bit of a dance goes on. When you've had a book that did quite well, typically the author goes, time to strike, and they'll come up with 5 or 6 ideas, and the publisher will look at them all and go, I didn't realize you were actually suffering from mental problems. These are mad. They're not going to work. In this case, it was totally different. My publisher said to me, hey, what do you know about Carl Perkins? And I repeated what I've just told you. I knew the outline of this story, but not much more. And they said, would you be interested in writing a book? And I guess I'm at the point of my career where 10 years ago, I might have gone, look, I'm not sufficiently qualified to do this. But now I understand about the potential of research and just the simple curiosity. I wanted to learn more too. And then, simple, someone's going to pay me to learn more about a guy I'm really interested in. And in exchange, I have to write a book. It sounds like a pretty fair deal to me. So,
not a bad gig. Yeah.
Not a bad gig at all. Yeah. And, the next 12 months was spent really digging into this guy's life story, which, I found out to be this remarkable roller coaster. I think it should be a streaming series, a musical, and I don't know, a podcast as well. There's so much stuff there, so much heartache, so many successes, so many setbacks, so much tragedy, and ultimately, this guy gets the dues that he deserves, gets them later in life. So, in a weird way, it's a feel-good story.
Yeah, he came from meager beginnings too. He was working on a cotton plantation and back in the late 30s. I think he was like 13 years old when he's working a day and night, and we'll get to all that. But were there any songs that you didn't know from him that, as you're writing this book, I'm sure you listen to a lot of his music. Like, do you have any particular songs you're a fan of? Matchbox is great, of course. Blue Suede Shoes, but there's some really good stuff.
There's some mid-career stuff. He recorded for Sun, then he went to Columbia, then he was bouncing between smaller labels. He did a really good record called Country Boy's Dream, which is just basically sort of semi-autobiographical. It's about him, and there's great family shots on the cover of the record. I think his parents appear on the back cover. There's some stuff. There's a song he wrote in the 70s called The Trip, which is not quite as psychedelic as it sounds. There's another one called State of Confusion, which is almost social comment stuff. It says the deeper you dig, and because he recorded a lot. I mean, this is a guy who spent a lot of time in the studio, made a lot of music. Once you get beyond the early rockabilly stuff, which most of it's pretty well known, of course, Blue Suede Shoes and Pink Pedal Pushers and the Beatles stuff, Matchbox, Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby, Honey Don't. Once you get into the mid-career where he's really pushing the boundaries a lot. And of course, he also wrote Daddy Sang Bass, which became a monster hit for Johnny Cash, and I write a bit about the inspiration for that, how it came out of Will the Circle Be Unbroken, that old gospel song that country acts tend to end their shows with. I've seen it played a dozen times, at the end of shows. So there's stuff like that I knew in a lot of cases by the cover, not by Carl's original, so it was interesting to really track that.
That's interesting, right? Because I always thought Blue Suede Shoes was an Elvis song.
There you go. So, he was a really solid songwriter who probably didn't quite get the props he deserved for that. But someone who continued to record, right through pretty much to the end of his life. So there's a big body of work there. But I'd recommend having a look around late 60s, early 70s. He did some really interesting one-off stuff then. None of it, no hits, but some really, really interesting and quite unexpected stuff. There's a song I always go back to, Restless, that he later recorded with Tom Petty. It's just one of my favorite songs of all because I understand what it's like to have itchy feet,
If that's on Spotify, because I always put together a playlist. If that's on Spotify, I'll include it.
Yeah, it's funny. My favorite version is the one he did with Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers for a tribute record for Carl called Go Cat Go. That's just great. And you can just the fun they're having in the studio while they're recording, that comes through on the recording. It just sounds like a bunch of guys just having a blast. And ultimately, I think that's maybe what Carl was always hoping for, because he got stuck into some weird studio situations where he was uncomfortable with it, be it at some where it was quick, quick and nasty in a lot of cases. Although he was probably more suited to that than he was when he went to Columbia, and there's a lot of musicians surrounding him, and he's being force-fed material to record, and it's really not sitting comfortably with him. You could tell later on, once he gets in the studio with Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, or gets on stage with them, as he did at the Fillmore when they did that 20-night run, I think in the late 90s. Just the reverence, the way he's treated on stage by these guys, and the way he locks into a groove with them. It's not like, he's out the front doing his thing and they're just backing him up. I mean, they're really playing together. And the same with Dylan. He got up and played with Dylan one night when Dylan was in Jackson. And you can really tell, the guys in Dylan band, as complicated as that relationship always was, if you've seen a lot of Dylan shows like I have, it feels like they're going, damn, why can't we play with this guy all the time? He's great.
Yeah.
So yeah, he was really held in high regard by a lot of musicians, probably maybe best expressed live, perhaps. I think maybe, when he got up just in front of an audience and just did his thing, maybe that's the best representation of Carl Perkins' music.
And from reading the book, you find out Carl grew up in meager beginnings. Grew up in the late 30s during the Great Depression. In fact, the first time he ever heard music that really moved him, he was literally working on a cotton plantation in Tennessee. That story leads off chapter 1. Talk about his beginnings, his childhood, what it was like for him growing up.
The idea of this kind of existence is just, it's sort of takes on almost like a mythic like quality to me. I just, very hard to get my head around how hard it would have been for him at that time. Yeah, it's a great story. He was taught to play guitar by an African American guy, fellow cotton picker, Uncle John Westbrook, who said, he had a 4-string beaten up old guitar that he gave to Carl. And I think the story goes that there was so much lacquer on the guitar from it had been painted over so many times, it weighed a ton. It only had 4 strings. And the best advice he gave him was, what did he say? Just make sure you bend those strings, Carly. He kept doing that for the rest of his life, you know. But it's great. It's got this kind of mythic quality, as you say. It's very much. It feels like the script to a movie. This sort of rags to riches story. Yeah, and I mean, he was never cut out for education. I think he left in the 8th grade, formed a band with his brothers, and went and played. Dude, I thought Australian pubs in the 70s were rough. Okay, those roadhouses that Carl and a lot of other guys from that generation played in. My God,
The honky tonks.
I thought they were just an invention of the Dukes of Hazzard.
Yeah.
But then to do some research and listen to people talking about them, my God, there's a story in the book where Carl just on stage and a woman just pulls out a gun and shoots a boyfriend right between the eyes.
Yeah. Insane.
Oh, it
Insane.
was madhouse.
But I think that's where he developed a style of songwriting there, because there's a part in the book where he talks about he knew he had to speed up the tempo of his songs to get people on the dance floor. So is that really where he's kind of cutting his teeth there doing the honky tonks? He also listened to the Grand Ole Opry on the radio. So I know he learned songs from listening to the radio too.
Yeah, I mean, he's hearing Bill Monroe and Western swing, basically, Bob Wills, guys like that. But he's juicing these songs up. He's playing it with his brothers, and he realizes he had to play it louder and faster to get the attention of all these. Basically the honky tonks were. I think a night at a honky tonk would be a series of brawls interrupted briefly by music. That's pretty much what it came down to.
Like the scene out of the Blues Brothers movie when they're throwing the
And it was
beer.
really, but it felt really familiar to me because I know Australian pubs in the 70s were really rough and rowdy places where the bands had to play louder and harder to get heard and to get it noticed by the audience. And this is with the type of venues that produced AC/DC, In Excess, Midnight Oil, all those great bands. So while I'm writing this and thinking, describing these honky tonks, I'm thinking back about my upbringing in these pubs, and it was very, very similar. These places were rough, but if you played well and you played loud and hard and fast, you typically got the attention of the audience and won them over. And that's
And
what
they'd
Carl was
invite him
doing.
back.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, but just the descriptions of some of these places where they'd bolt the furniture to the floor so it didn't get torn up and hit used as a weapon. You know, just crazy, just
Yeah.
really, really crazy stuff. But it was a great upbringing. You're absolutely right. And the turning point. I think it was 1954, and he heard Elvis's version of Blue Moon of Kentucky on the radio, which Elvis had juiced up as well. And Carl's wife, Alda, turned and said, "That's you." And he said, "I wish it was." So that was a real turning point for him because he realized, hey, someone else is doing this too. Maybe it has commercial potential.
Yeah, his story with Elvis, they're like neck and neck until he gets into that car accident. I didn't know
Totally.
about that, so that's interesting. We're almost at that point, but let's talk about the first song he wrote, which was about a girl he liked in school, and he told the story to Paul McCartney. You include that story in the book. Martha Faye Johnston was her name.
Yeah, the song was it "Take Me to the Movie Mag"?
Yeah,
It's sort of a Hank Williams type song. It's quite sentimental. I guess it's a ballad, a sort of Western ballad. Um, he played it to. It was the first song he recorded for Sam Phillips, and Phil or played to Sam Phillips, and Phillips like, "Oh, it's okay, but what else have you got? What else have you got?" Sorry, let me correct you there. Correct me there. He went in and they played a bunch of covers for
that's
Sam.
right. Yep.
Yeah, and Sam was like, "Do you have anything original?" And he played them "Take Me to the Movie Mag," and which eventually just became Movie Mag. And he went, "That I like that. That's interesting. Come back with more of that stuff. Give me something original. There's enough covers out there. Everybody else is doing covers. We don't need another Hank Williams." And it's funny because I mean, after they played these covers to Phillips, and he sort of shrugged when they were playing them. They were about to bail. His brothers who were in his band, Jay and Clayton, said, "Well, to hell with him. Let's go." And Carl said, "No, hang on." And they just played in that one original. It was really a big turning point because that got Phillips's interest. Because obviously he wanted people to have songwriting, publishing deals with Sun Records, so he would have a stake in every record they released commercially. Smart guy.
Yeah, yeah. And hearing Blue Moon on the radio was what inspired him to go to
That's right.
Memphis
Yeah, yeah. He
and
loaded
record.
up the Cadillac. It's a great story. So Carl, because he had no idea about the music business. I mean, the music business, what the hell is this, And he he was just playing honky tonks at that point. So they loaded up the car with all their gear, drove down because they found out where Sun's studio was and where this music was coming from. Drove down. The first mistake he made was parking in Sam Phillips' parking spot. Not a great idea. Second mistake he made was maybe not calling ahead to let them know he was going to come down and audition. And Marianne Keisker, who was Sam Phillips' assistant, she's like, "He's not here. You're gonna have to go." And he said, "No, we're gonna wait." And of course, Phillips came in and it's like, "Who's in my parking spot? What the hell is this?" And eventually was willing to listen to them because he was on the lookout. It's a time Elvis's records are starting to take off, but Phillips knows that Elvis isn't going to last long. And I think Johnny Cash had just joined the label, so he was really on the lookout for new talent. And eventually, during that session, he got wise to the fact that Carl had songwriting potential. And great voice, great guitar player, surrounded by a good band. At that point, Fluke Holland, who ended up being Johnny Cash's drummer for about 150 years, he was on the kit. So he was surrounded by good players.
And his two brothers were still in the band at that time.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. Jay and Clayton. Yeah.
Yeah, you talk about songwriting potential. He writes a song called Blue Suede Shoes. That's pretty good. That's pretty good songwriting skills right there. That was his
Yeah.
breakthrough single. It took a while though. That was
Yeah. It
a
did.
few years later.
I think it was late 55, but there's a couple of versions of the story. Carl,
Right.
it has to be said, would never let the facts get in the way of a really good story. And I say that in the best way possible. He was a very entertaining, if you listen to interviews with him or watch him interview, he's a very good raconteur. So his version of events was it happened at one of the honky tonks he was playing. There's dancers down the front and Carl's playing a set. And at the end of a set, this guy's dancing with this pretty girl, and he says basically, "Hey, whoa, back off! Don't tread on my suedes. Watch out for my shoes." And Carl's reaction was, "What the hell's wrong with this guy? He's got this beautiful woman, and he's worried about his shoes." But at the same time, there's a story that Johnny Cash swears that he told Carl about his time in Germany in the army when he met an African American guy who was the sharpest dresser amongst all the servicemen there. And he wore blue suede shoes. And Johnny swears that he told Carl this story. So look, it's probably a commingling of the two. These
They're
two
both
things.
great stories.
Great stories. The idea for the song came to Carl as he's driving home from a gig. He has nowhere to write the lyrics, so he scrawls them onto I think it was like a potato bag or something. And one of the funny takeaways from that is that he spelt Carl was not a well educated in the classic sense kind of guy. I think he spelt Suede Swade or something like that. Kept the bag, framed it on his wall so that all his visitors could go, Carl, your spelling, it needs a bit of work. And I think Valda said to his wife, said to him, Carl, that there's great lyrics he played to the song, but you might want to work on his spelling.
Where is that bag? I don't know if you mentioned in the book. Is it in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame?
I think no, I think it's still in whichever family member is in Carl's house now. I
Yeah.
think, but yeah, it should be in the Hall of Fame.
Oh,
Absolutely, yeah.
March 21st, 1956, Carl and the Perkins Brothers Band play a show in Virginia. They head for New York City for an appearance on the Perry Como Show. Carl is quoted in the book saying, I remember the Chesapeake Bay Ferry, and it's the last thing I remember for 3 days. What happened that night?
Yeah, such a turning point. I mean, Blue Suede Shoes is getting really good response in. I think what did Phillips call it? A triple threat. It's in R&B, pop, and I think also country charts. So it's doing really really well, getting exposure. Carl's got a booking on the Perry Como show, which was in fact the first nationwide show of that type. So, and Elvis hadn't. I don't think by this point Elvis had even done a show that had nationwide broadcasting. So, this is a huge moment. Carl could be the first of these rockers to really get the biggest possible exposure, and it would have sent Blue Suede Shoes way over the top. It would have been an enormous hit. They have this terrible car crash. They're in a hurry they're driving to New York, typical thing. We'll play some gigs on the way. And they have this horrible, horrible crash. Carl comes away with a bunch of broken bones and a real mess. He's in traction in the hospital, but his brother is Jay's in even worse shape. He breaks his neck, basically. It's an absolute tragedy. And Carl's convalescing in the hospital when he sees Elvis on, I think, the Milton Berle show. And he's like, damn, man, there's my opportunity gone. Because he knew that as soon as people see Elvis from coast to coast, he's gone. Because, as you said earlier, Carl didn't have Elvis's sort of raw sex appeal. He wasn't, he was a good looking rooster, but he didn't look like Elvis.
Right.
Elvis.
His hair was thinning at a young age.
Yeah. He
And
was a country boy. And
yeah.
whereas Elvis, he looked like he'd been sent down from outer space. He
Oh,
was just
yeah.
an amazing dude with this incredible voice. And of course,
And
by
it's just interesting to note too. Elvis had the number one single with Heartbreak Hotel. Right behind him at number two is Blue Suede Shoes, Carl Perkins.
that's
So
right.
they're
And of
neck
course,
and neck right there.
yeah, that's right. See, and the theory is that if this accident didn't happen, if Carl had gotten to the Milton Berle show, the Perry Como show, and done his spot, he really could have, usurped Elvis, possibly, at least for that brief time. Elvis, meanwhile, has been talked into cutting a version of Blue Suede Shoes, which was the style at the time. If someone had a hit song, you went and did your own version. Everybody was doing it. But to his credit, he said, no, yeah, he cut it, but he said, don't release it as a single. I want my friend, because they were friends by this point. He said, I want my friend Carl's record to get every possibility it can. And of course, he also knew that Carl was laid up in the hospital. It took a couple of months for Carl to get back into action. But at that time, 956, everything's moving so quickly. Everybody, you're pumping out singles every couple of months. Television is starting to have a huge impact. Radio is enormous. There's even music media now. You've got Billboard and Cashbox and these magazines. The mainstream newspapers are writing about this thing called rock and roll. You had to be in the game to really keep up. And unfortunately, Carl was on the sidelines for a couple of months, and it really put a huge crimp in his potential, particularly the potential for Blue Suede Shoes to become, I guess, rock around the clock, that kind of size. Even though it's still considered a rock and roll benchmark, it probably didn't have quite the same, didn't sell the same amount as, a Heartbreak Hotel, a Rock Around the Clock, a Great Balls of Fire, one of those songs.
His peers said it kept him from being as big, if not bigger than Elvis.
Yeah,
Do you
yeah,
think?
absolutely. Yeah, well, I agree. Probably only for a short period of time. I wouldn't think that Carl was just cut from different cloth. He was more of yeah, he's a
He
bit
didn't have that management that Elvis had, the Colonel too. Like he did, the Colonel was really pushing to get Elvis. Yeah. Yeah. Colonel was pushing for Elvis to get out there. He was really working that angle with Elvis to get him out there and promote him. So I'm not sure if, did Carl have a manager at the
Yeah,
time? Was
yeah, a guy called Bob Neal, who was a promoter and
Yeah,
a
that's
DJ in
right.
Memphis. But he looked after all these guys before they became big. He looked after Elvis as well before, the Colonel got his mitts on him. But look, I think Carl also acknowledged, accident or no accident, he acknowledged that Elvis was a very different character to him and had probably much greater, broader commercial potential. Carl did a couple of films, but he was never going to be a movie star.
Yeah, yeah.
Although we may get to that later, he had one great cameo later in his life that just to this day
Yes.
makes me think, damn, he could have been a good character actor.
That's right. That was in late '70s, early '80s. I think he was in just one movie
Yeah,
only.
John Landis movie called Into the Night. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And he, actually, if we talk about it now, it just kills me because his big scene in the film, he's playing this tough guy, this thug basically, and he gets into a knife fight with David Bowie's character. And I mean, if you want two people from completely different sides of the cultural spectrum, you've got Ziggy Stardust up against Mr. Blue Suede Shoes in a knife fight. I mean, come on, what's the likelihood of that?
I've
And
never
it's a
seen the
great,
movie. Never even heard
oh,
of
it's,
it.
it's great. Yeah, Jeff. It's one of Jeff Goldblum's and Michelle Pfeiffer's early movies. John Landis
Wow.
was, I think was it post Blues Brothers? It might have been
What
just post Blues Brothers, but it was a smaller project, and it was just sort of it's a cult film. I think it's
Yeah.
great. It's really, and these musical and filmmaker cameos throughout the film are amazing. It's like every second scene you're going, isn't that director? Hang on, there's David Bowie, there's Carl Perkins. It's really good.
Author Jeff Apter, a new book out November 26th called Carl Perkins, The King of Rockabilly. What led to his falling out with Sam Phillips and Sun Records?
It's like everybody else, money.
Yeah.
Simple money. You've sold 1 million records and you're wondering, why am I still struggling to pay the rent? Phillips had everybody on a 3% royalty, which is really next to nothing. That's paying pennies on the dollar. Um, Johnny Cash, meanwhile, had Elvis had already gone. He'd gone to RCA Victor for outrageous amounts of money. Well, what seemed like outrageous amounts of money at the time. Johnny Cash had already been talking to Columbia because he saw the limitations of Sun. You've got to keep in mind too, Sun, as renowned as and important as the music that came out of Sun Studios in the 50s was, it was a shoestring operation. I remember doing a tour of the studio and I'm thinking, that's it?
Tiny?
It's the smallest tour in the world because you stand still and look at each corner and go, well, there it is. I mean, obviously it's more about the mood and the atmosphere of the place, and you feel that definitely, but it's tiny. It's really, really small. His records were made on very small budgets. It wasn't like, thinking about Roy Orbison now, when Roy wanted to use strings, well, there was no string section in Sun Studios, I can assure you. You
Muscle
know,
Shoals was like that too. Tiny
yeah,
little building.
yeah, yeah. And so a lot of these guys felt shortchanged, as they all acknowledged Sam Phillips' role. Without Sam Phillips, we wouldn't be talking about these guys. But they also acknowledged that he was not doing them not a lot of justice financially. They had the potential to make more money, and the major labels were reaching out to them already. So Carl ended up going with Johnny Cash and going to Columbia, for better or worse.
Yeah, he was struggling to write a hit song under Columbia. By the late '50s, his popularity was starting to fade. He talks about his drinking being an issue at that time, but it was a long time until he kicked that. But was that contributing to his decline commercially? Did it affect his songwriting?
Yeah, I mean, he was pumping out a lot of good songs. If you look at Carl's back catalogue of music, there's a lot of good music from a lot of good songs from that time that just because they weren't Blue Suede Shoes, they didn't have the same impact. And it wasn't like his music was being covered by a lot of other people too. He ultimately developed into a great songwriter who's a lot of people wanted to record his music. But at that point, he was trying to write hits for himself. And also when he's working with Columbia, they're putting him, he's gone from this bare bones operation at Sun to quite a sophisticated recording environment, which didn't really suit him either. And that was difficult for him. He really floundered. Yeah, sure, he was boozing a lot as well. Still playing gigs, but now he's third on the bill to nobody at the what was that lounge, the Golden Nugget in Vegas. He's playing Vegas. He's not even playing the big rooms. So it's getting really tough for him. And there's a point, until Johnny Cash comes calling, that Carl was as good as given up. His brothers had, his one brother had died, another one had become an alcoholic. It was a real mess. It really, really was. And Carl was pretty much going to say, well, okay, maybe I should become a farmer. Maybe I should go back and because he'd put away enough money to, I think, buy a small block of land, and he was thinking maybe I could just settle into a totally different world. Maybe music isn't for me. But as happened throughout the rest of his life, someone came calling. And in this instance, it was Johnny Cash.
Yeah, and the Beatles too.
Oh, the
Talk
Beatles
about
too.
that.
Yeah,
They
yeah. Actually,
resurrect his career.
to be
They were
honest, the
big
Beatles
fans
was
of his.
first. That's right. I think Carl went to the UK in '63 or '64, and little did he know. I mean, the Beatles to him, he knew a little bit about them. He'd heard a bit of their music, and it's at the point where the Beatles haven't quite exploded in America yet. Um, and when he got there, it's his first tour of the UK. He's touring with Chuck Berry, and, Carl's a few years past his commercial prime at that point, and suddenly he's like a godlike figure to these guys. They've got to meet Carl Perkins. And in fact, when he met them, they were recording Matchbox, if I'm not mistaken, which was one of, I think, three of his songs that they recorded. And he's like, my God, and this was a revelation that a lot of American artists had at that time. People love me in England. I had no idea. The blues guys all got this experience when they thought their career was fizzling out in the States. They go and play in the UK to university audiences, college audiences, and people just love them. The Beatles admired Carl to the point that when they first started out, one of their first UK tours, George Harrison decided to rechristen himself Carl Harrison. He was so enamored of Carl's guitar playing and songwriting, and eventually they became really good friends. So yeah, it was a big lifeline. And whenever the Beatles would record one of Carl's songs, I think it was something like $50,000 in the bank, and that was a lot more than he'd ever seen from Sam Phillips. So he realized
Because of
this is
publishing, right? Is that what you're talking about? So, yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And just the simple fact that the hottest band on the planet, or the soon to be hottest band on the planet, is talking him up.
Oh,
It really put him back
huge.
in the spotlight. Yeah. And I've seen this, doing research for this book and doing other projects, how it happened continually. With Roy Orbison was another one. He went to the UK, and again, it was the Beatles that really loved him. And in fact, that's how he ended up wearing those dark shades for the rest of his life. We'll get onto that in another conversation. But no, it's real. I think it's really interesting from an outsider's perspective as an Australian, looking at these great American careers and realizing what a big role the UK played in keeping these guys or returning them to the spotlight and really helping them maintain careers that they thought was done and dusted. They were playing, like I say, third on the bill to nobody on a Tuesday night, for $50 or $1 at the door, and a couple of years ago, in Carl's case, he'd had a multi-million seller. That was a big slap in the face. It was a
They're
big.
great. Yeah, those are great stories. Like Peter Frampton at the Rock Hall ceremonies talking about David Bowie. We just talked about David Bowie, and Bowie brought him out on tour in the '80s when
Spiders
Frampton
from
was
Mars, wasn't
down
he?
and out.
Yeah, that's right. He was. Oh, sorry, the Glass Spider tour. Yeah,
Yes, yes,
I
he
remember
brought
when he
him out.
came here, and we're all going, "Is that Peter Frampton? What
Yes,
the hell's he doing there?"
he
You
was
know?
in the same spot. He's ready to call it call it a career, and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
David Bowie helped him out. So that's what happens with Carl with the Beatles, also with Johnny Cash, which we're about to get to. But I want to ask about a book that he read in the late '60s called The Power of Positive Thinking. Was that the beginning of his road to beating his demons with alcohol?
I think to a degree. I mean, that was such a pop culture phenomenon back then. Was it Norman Vincent Peale? I remember as a kid hearing the name and thinking, "What the hell's that?" And I was too young to really be part of that zeitgeist, I guess. But I think it did change his mindset. This is, Carl's looking for solutions to his problems, and I think that book offered them in quite easy to digest, bite-sized chunks. And I think the story I related about everybody be on the tour bus having a great time, and he'd be there with his head in this book going, maybe this is the solution to my problems, my drinking problems, my career problems. So yeah, I think it was incredibly helpful. I'm not sure if you or I read the book today whether we'd find it as convincing as Carl did in the late '60s. It's probably a bit trite and cliched now, but it was at a time of self-help becoming a big thing, and people admitting quite readily that they're going into therapy, which certainly in the '50s wasn't as commonplace. So yeah, it played its role, but I think Johnny Cash, as we're about to get to, he played a much bigger role.
Yeah, talk about his working relationship and his friendship with it's important to talk about because, yeah, like you said, Johnny Cash was a huge help to
Well,
Carl.
yeah, I mean, these guys grew up basically on the opposite side of the Mississippi, doing exactly the same thing. Cash was working on the cotton in the cotton fields as well. Both living hand to mouth, really poor circumstances. Cash, of course, had the tragic loss of his younger brother when he was a kid that really, I think, left a huge scar on him emotionally for the rest of his life. Carl had been through some tough stuff with his parents and his own family. They both recorded for Sun. They were both playing pretty much the same circuit, both managed by Bob Neal at some point, and both split for Columbia at the same time. Cash's career had prospered, whereas Carl's hadn't, despite there's some really good recordings that he did with Columbia that are worth checking out. I'll do a playlist or something for you, but there's some really good stuff there that really went under the radar. Anyway, the
Yeah.
point is, Carl's a mess. It's I'm not sure which year it was, hitting mid 60s. He's had a hunting accident. Carl is a little accident prone. He shot himself in the foot, and he's at home. He's on the couch. His foot's in a cast. He's going, "What the hell is with my career? Is done. It's all over for me. His records aren't selling. The gigs are drying up." And Valda, his wife, said, "I think Johnny Cash's tour bus is outside. Carl, what's the story?" Like, don't be ridiculous, And there it was. Cash had heard that Carl was on hard, doing it rough. He'd had this accident. He just happened to be swinging through. I think Carl by this point is probably living in Jackson, and he just drops in. "Yeah, Carl, how you doing? Why don't you come out and play some shows with me? Just one or two. Just come on, play a few songs, see how it feels." And Carl's like, "No, no, man, I just rather wallow here in my my misery." He said, "No," he insisted. He said, "Come on, just do one or two shows." And Carl got out and he'd play a couple of songs as a guest on and Johnny. And Johnny had this big road show at that time. It's him, it's June Carter Cash, it's the Carter family, it's the Tennessee Three. I think eventually the Statler brothers came along. It's a road show. It's a big, big tour. And Carl really slotted in brilliantly into that because, here's Mr. Carl Perkins, Mr. Blue Suede Shoes. He's going to play a few songs. Um, and he did, and he enjoyed it to the point where Cash said to him, "Come on, join the band, join us, become part of the road show." And Carl's initial reluctance was, I guess, assuaged by the simple fact that Cash is offering him a lifeline. It's another career. And Carl ended up being his. Well, Cash never said he was my backing band or my guitarist. He would never ever say that. He'd say, "This is my friend Carl Perkins, and he's on the show with us," even though Carl would play in his backing band. Um, and so Carl would do his spot and then come out and play in the band, and people just loved it. And it really gave him a second wind. And he ended up doing that for, I think, 10 years.
Wow.
It was
That's a
it was
real
a long.
friend, man. That's doing a
Oh yeah, and
solid for someone.
well, Carl was a practical guy. He saw this as the opportunity to. He's on a wage. He's getting to see the world. God, as he said, I played for presidents and prisoners and everyone in between. He played at the White House. He played at Folsom Prison. He played at San Quentin. Played all around the world. I'm pretty sure they toured Australia as well. So he had this great opportunity to really see the world, get paid for it, hang out with his buddy Johnny Cash, and also at the same time they're both confronting their own demons. They've made this pact. Cash has got a big problem with pills to the point where, he just about given up too. Carl's drinking too much. And they made this pact, if whoever makes the first attempt to give up, I'll come along with you, or I think there might have been $100 bet involved as well. So, Cash throws away his pills, and Carl has this revelation one day after a gig when he was so drunk the night before the show he could barely make it on stage. He's like, "I can't do this. I cannot do this anymore." So wakes up in the morning, and again, it could be a Carl embellishment, but it's a great story where he wakes up and he's in the big tour van, and they're parked on the shores of a beach somewhere. They're traveling from gig to gig. Everybody else is out there in the sun having a fine old time, and Carl wakes up with a mouth like a bird cage and a head full of cobwebs, feeling like death. And he just said, "That's it." And he picked up whatever bottle he had, walked out into the water, and just threw it into the drink, and allegedly never drank again. I don't
Yeah.
think it was that simple,
But
but
it's a great story.
it's a great story. I think, there were relapses, of course. He's on the road, and he's also, Carl's a big family man. He's got his own brood by this time, and he's got this great connection with his wife, Valda. And every night on the road, he'd call her and he'd say to her, which I think is really quite beautiful, he'd say, look out the window, particularly if they're in the same country. Say, can you see the moon? Yeah, I can. I'm looking at it too, Vala, which means I'm
Yeah.
looking at you. It's really quite beautiful. So they had this really strong bond. So that got him through. And eventually, yeah, he did stop drinking and he did get back into the spotlight and he became a big part of Johnny Cash's TV show as well. And he's also making really good solo records, like Country Boy's Dream and a whole bunch of stuff in the 60s and into the 70s that, again, went under the radar, but I think are really well worth visiting because he was really becoming a great guitar picker, like a really good player. And he was writing really, really good songs that eventually started to get rediscovered by people and, who went, damn, that's Carl Perkins. Yeah, he's good. Yeah, I saw him on the Johnny Cash show. Didn't he used to have a hit record? So there's all this rediscovery of Carl, which I think was, for him was not just life affirming, but I think it actually, kept him alive. It really did.
Yeah, you talk about all the setbacks that he had throughout his life. Christmas 1973, Johnny Cash is the one who makes the call to Carl to tell him his brother Clayton had taken
Yeah,
his life.
yeah.
Talk
Well,
about that relationship. They had a falling out 10 years earlier and Clayton never recovered.
that's right. Yeah. Well, Clayton was in the family band, the Perkins brothers band, and he was a wild card, and he'd got into a well, it wasn't he didn't get into a fight. He just king hit Red Foley, the country musician, in a hotel, and Carl just went, man, that is it. This is at the point when Carl's at his lowest ebb too, and he just put him in the car, and I think it was a 400-mile drive back to Jackson. He just dropped him out the front of his parents' house and said, that's it, I'm done with this guy. And he went right off the rails. He became a drifter, basically, an alcoholic, and had been found. If I remember correctly, one of Carl's kids found him. Where's Uncle Jay? Oh, he's at home, and they went and found him in bed, and he died, and the house had burned. It's just this horrible story.
Terrible. I
Yeah,
was watching a clip of the band together when there is Carl with his brother and his brother's just looking young and healthy and he's playing. I think he played guitar. Was he a bass? Was he the bassist?
played the string bass. Yeah,
The
yeah,
string
yeah.
bass, you see him there and you just see this whole life ahead of him and he's on television. And then to see what happened is very
Yeah,
sad.
yeah.
Very
Well,
sad.
as Carl's career went downhill, these guys sort of went with him. Unfortunately, his other brother had already died as a sort of long term result of the car accident that they had. So there's a lot of tragedy in his life. Yeah. So Johnny Cash has got the word that he's dead, and he had to tell Carl, who's out on the road with him. And it's just so devastating. And again, I um, think about this more broadly. This is stuff that happened to Roy Orbison too. The terrible tragedies in these guys' life. Elvis losing his mother. All this stuff. It's almost like they'd made some deal where you're going to have all this great success, but the downside of it is going to be really bad,
Yeah.
and you're
The
going to have
Crossroads, right? Yeah.
yeah,
The
the
Robert
crossroads.
Johnson story.
Absolutely. Yeah. So Carl, he went home and he had to acknowledge that basically he'd rejected his brother. Understandably, he created absolute chaos for him, but it's just such a heavy weight to bear.
Oh,
Really,
the
really,
guilt that
really.
he must have felt. Yeah. But it wasn't his fault, but
No, but he felt responsibility
he
because
felt
he was
responsibility.
he
Yeah.
was the
That
leader
was,
of the band. And he was the brother who had some success and was supposed to help out his other siblings, but it just didn't work out that way.
look at the Fogerty brothers, John Fogerty
That's a soap opera right
and
there.
his brother.
That's I think a musical, a mini series, and probably a documentary. There's so much
Yeah.
drama there. It's awful. And it's tough. I guess now you think about the Gallagher brothers in Oasis. It's like I
Right.
think the only reason they're speaking to each other now is because they're going to be making a hell of a lot of money over the next
Oh,
12 months.
yeah. The Black Crows too, right? Chris and Rich
Yeah,
Robinson, they're out on the road. They just came
actually,
here to Connecticut this week.
it's funny you say that. Now, it was either the Gallaghers or the Robinsons said of each other, "Oh boy, I didn't know how bad sibling rivalry was until I went out on the road with these guys."
Yeah, I can't remember which one either,
It was
but
probably both
it's
of them,
funny.
to be honest. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
and the Kinks as well, Ray and Day Davies, they always had
Yep.
problems. So it's just, unfortunately, it's sort of part of rock and roll folklore, perhaps. Unfortunately, siblings don't always mesh, and there's this drama. And like I say, in Carl's point, it was just this horrible news. Your brother's dead, and he took the weight really. He felt it was his problem. He felt it was his creation, and it's just another burden that he had to carry.
You talk about what could have been. We were talking about how far his career would have gone if not for the car accident. But then there's a twist of fate where when Carl reads about Elvis's death in August of 77, Carl's thinking at that point now he actually felt bad for Elvis because that level of fame that Elvis had to go through, he felt that that led to Elvis's demise. And he just
Yeah,
thought, boy, maybe I was better off the way
it's
things
interesting,
turned
isn't
out.
it?
You know,
It says a lot
he
about the
felt
guy.
so bad for Elvis. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I
It
think he
said
said he got to see him maybe a week before he passed or a day or two before Elvis passed. I can't recall, but
he tried to see him at Graceland, but got turned away like everybody
yeah.
else did. Except uh, Carl just drove away, whereas Jerry Lee Lewis came back with a gun. Different people, different characters. But yeah, I think, and it's really an interesting reflection on the way Carl saw the world. Is that a lot of people would have craved Elvis's level of success? My God, he was the Michael Jackson of his era. Really, he was
Oh,
the absolute center of the
yeah.
universe. He was the Coca Cola. He was the Muhammad Ali.
The first major pop star.
Yeah, absolutely. And Carl, I think, firstly, he realized that he just didn't have the same zhush as Elvis. He didn't have that same thing. And
Who
then he
did?
realized
Nobody but
nobody
Elvis.
did. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then later in life, when Elvis died, he was only 42. Carl, sort of was, I won't say he was thankful, but he was very much aware that, wow, maybe I was fortunate not to have had to endure this weird world into which Elvis disappeared. And again, very much like Michael Jackson, kind of crazy town where you can't get out, you can't go anywhere. Your life is you're just sort of in a cocoon, because of fans and adulation and pressure and people depending on you. It's just too much.
I would say too, just the fact that Carl Perkins went through what he did with his career, it kind of humbled him. It kind of kept him a little more grounded. And whereas Elvis, just everybody said yes to him. Whereas Carl
Yeah.
Perkins, he was down and out to the point where he was just like everybody else, just having to scrape by to make things work. But Elvis,
And then
if
simple
somebody said no to Elvis, he would have just fired him and said, "I'm going to get somebody in here who's going to say yes."
Yeah, and simple stuff too. I mean, Carl just really liked having a wife and family. The simple
Yeah,
stuff, a nice
yeah,
home. As it eventually got a really nice place in Jackson, with guitar motifs in the garden, which I like.
yeah.
Nice touch. But just simple things like that. I guess maybe his desires and his tastes were much simpler, much more country, even though him and Elvis came from very, very similar environment. It was just something about more down home about Carl. Johnny Cash to a degree too, although he became a super duper star and, I'm pretty sure enjoyed the trappings of fame. At the same time, his second wife, June Carter Cash, she was there by his side up until his death. There was a pretty tight bond. I just heard a great story. I don't know if you've listened to Tom Petty's Buried Treasure for
Yeah,
sure,
on
but
Sirius XM. Yeah.
yeah, they put them all up online now, and I was listening to one, and he was talking about working with Johnny and June Carter Cash, and he said when they were doing the Rick Rubin stuff, one morning he came into the studio, the American recordings. One day he came into the studio, and as he drove in, he said, "There's Johnny and June sitting at the bus stand, the bus stop like, across the street." It's like, what the hell is this? What are they working on the cheap or something? What's going on? And he said they came into the studio and he said, John, Jim, what are you doing? He said, oh, we just wanted to sit there and see if anybody recognized us. But no one did. No one did. So we came back inside. And it
That's
sort of
an
made me think, that's the kind of, Carl would say that, Carl
Yeah,
put,
that's an awesome story.
hey,
I tell you, man, Tom Petty. It's no surprise that he was a fan of Carl Perkins. Very similar, just solid songwriter. It's just technically, could get the job done, but he wasn't the kind of guy who's going to blow you away with that kind of stuff. Just an amazing songwriter. He
and he was
could,
always a fan. Tom Petty, I think, above and
yeah,
beyond everything else, all this, and I'm a huge fan. I mean, one of the best shows, one of the best 4-song sets I've ever seen in my life was Tom Petty with Dylan here in 1986. And the
oh
Heartbreakers
yeah,
would come on mid-show and do a 4-song set, which I think was Rebels, Refugee, Don't Come Around Here No More, and American Girls. Like boom, boom,
yeah,
boom, boom. And Dylan was really bad. Like he was really bad.
really,
Eddie came on and the crowd is screaming more. This is the middle of the show and they're being encored. And I remember I was right down the front. You could see Dylan's like, oh, damn, man, what are you doing?
yeah.
You're taking my
Petty
people here.
was. Petty's
But
in
he
my
was a
top
fan.
5, man. Love
Yeah, him
Petty.
and Carl did a great version of one of Carl's songs called "Restless," and it's it's just you can just sense the fun they had in the studio doing this. It's just a breezy song about itchy feet, but they're picking and playing this song, and you can just tell it's the best time, as far as they're concerned, the best time they've ever had in their life together. It's just so good. And Petty got himself into a lot of really great situations like that in the last, I guess, 20 years of his life.
Yeah.
Johnny Cash. He's working with these really good people at the Wilburys, of course.
Oh,
Yeah. So I'm
love the
a
Wilburys.
huge admiration for him, and also I envy the guy that he was a fan first and foremost, and a great musician, and he just found himself in all these wonderful situations where he would have been, not unlike Carl with say the Beatles and Johnny Cash, and so on, would have been pinching himself, going, "How the hell did this happen? This is
Yeah.
great."
Yeah.
Carl was considered as a Wilbury too when
Was he
when
really?
yeah, when Roy
Oh, wait a
Orbison
minute.
died.
I think I heard that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. There was there was the big debate when Orbison died after the first record had been so
I
successful.
remember the debate. Yeah. Who's going to fill his spot?
And Carl was on the short list, but eventually I decided, it's sort of disrespectful to Roy to put anyone in the spot.
Which is, yeah, they decided to not replace him. Bruce Springsteen was rumored. I don't know if you remember
Really,
that.
Bruce
Yeah.
is it's too young.
Yeah, that would have been really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, they needed a senior partner, someone maybe a Del Shannon or someone like that, or
Yeah.
someone a little older. But yeah, so and also I think I really like the fact the Wilbury's second record was called Volume 3. That
I
just
know. I
it
know.
just appeals to me for some reason.
Yeah, you just avoid the sophomore slump. Just go right to record 3.
And number 3,
Yeah, that
which
was what, 89, I think, or 88 when that first album came out. And the 80s was a good decade for Carl. He did the film, like you said, and he was
yeah,
celebrated by the big artists of the time. And there was a TV
well,
special, right, that they put together.
yeah, well, that Rockabilly session was actually a real trailblazer because it was the first Cinemax special. Roy Orbison's Black and White Night came after that, and what had happened is Carl he pitched this idea. How about we do this concert, record a concert, make essentially a concert video, but it grew from that, and he actually sent video invitations to all the people he wanted involved, which I thought was really nice. A personal invitation rather than just having, I don't know, his manager contact their manager. He actually, this is sent to George Harrison, Friar Park, England, and it was a video saying, "Hey George, doing this thing, you might want to get involved. What do you think?" And in the end, it was Clapton, Ringo Starr, George Harrison, the guys from the Stray Cats, Roseanne Cash, Dave Edmunds. Just a great, great lineup. And there was the Cinemax people had come to Carl and said, "Okay, great, you've got this fantastic lineup. You got two Beatles, right? This is very rare. Two of the three surviving Beatles. No one's ever done this before. How about you play some Beatles songs?" And ultimately said, "No, that's not the idea. The idea, and everybody has agreed on this, is to do my stuff their own way." And ultimately, I think they did Beatles songs. Sorry, they did Carl songs that Beatles had recorded, but that was as close as it came. And it's great if you look at it. And I've been looking at it back to back with Black and White Night, which is the Roy Orbison Cinemax special. The Carl one is quite different because it's much more interactive. When you watch Black and White Night, the Roy Orbison one, it's great. The performances are fantastic, and Roy's in great voice, but everybody is in such awe that they sort of stand back, except for Springsteen. Whereas with Carl's session, everybody's interacting with him. Him and George Harrison are trading guitar solos, and then Clapton will step in and play something. And then Ringo will come down front, and it was really playful. And then in the end, they form, like the songwriter circle that you see at a lot of Nashville sessions. And also I think they do it on Austin City Limits as well, where they sit in that semicircle and
That's
all
a great
plays.
show. Austin City
Yeah,
Limits. Yeah.
there was and I think they call it the songwriter circle. Everybody got into this group and started playing together, and it's just really, it was a precursor to the unplugged stuff as well, so it was a real trailblazer. Really worth watching, and the look on Carl's face, it's just worth admission alone. He's just so thrilled that these young guns, or youngish guns, younger than him, and such revered players are willing to take this journey with him. It's a fantastic session.
Yeah, I think he was in his early 50s around that time. Then he got to
Yeah.
the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. before the decade was over. So that,
That's right. Sam Phillips inducted him, which of course is interesting because he had his business problems with Sam Phillips, but I think he was willing
yep.
to let that slide. And he was sitting with Roy Orbison actually, and he came back to the table, and Roy said, "Damn, I wish Elvis was here. He would have loved this." And I think absolutely.
Yeah.
These guys really they as supernova as all their careers went, there was a real fraternity between them.
You could
Cash,
tell that.
Orbison,
Yeah,
yeah,
sure.
absolutely. Carl being, I think, and again, when they did this thing called the Class of '85, which was a 30-year anniversary of Memphis music. It was an attempt to get the Million Dollar Quartet back together, but of course Elvis had gone by that point, so they brought in Roy Orbison. There's a fraternity. Yeah, these guys had came through the same environment with Sun Records, early hits. Um, really grass. You couldn't get any more blue collar than their background, so they had all that in common. And their careers had gone on all these crazy journeys, but eventually got to a point in middle aged where they're comfortable, and they're revered figures. If there was a Mount Rushmore of music, you'd have Orbison's face up, you had Johnny Cash, you'd have Carl's face up there for sure. So these guys have become these revered figures, these iconic figures. It's to me as tough as some of Carl's story is and was to tell, the late career stuff is really, really rewarding as a writer because you just go, thank God this guy got some acknowledgement.
Right. Yeah,
Finally, man,
that's
he got
exactly
his
it.
dues.
Exactly right.
Mm.
Yeah, he was diagnosed with cancer in 91, throat cancer, but he did recover and he kept going. Stayed pretty active through the mid 90s.
Oh, he was
What?
playing 100 nights a year. He had, well, what he did after he left Cash, he'd been sort of nurturing his sons Stan and Greg as musicians, and they were good players. And he sort of, in some ways, he saw how other people took their family out with them, and he thought, "Man, I can do that." So he formed a band with these guys and a couple of others called the CP Express, which I really like. And they start. This is the mid '70s. So he said to Johnny Cash, "Look, it's been a great ride, but it's my time to see if I can do my own thing again." And they went out on the road, and initially they're playing little. It's almost like he's been back in the Perkins brothers band playing the roadhouses and honky tonks, but he picked all these out of the way spots that people rarely came to and played just to get a feel for whether this works. And of course it did. And by the '80s, late '80s, they're playing 100 nights a week. They're playing all around the world, good money, and he's with his sons. So he's found this really interesting way to maintain a strong relationship with his now young adult sons. That if he'd been working solo, he may not have been able to nurture that relationship. I see it now with Neil Finn. We were talking about Neil Finn. He's brought,
Crowded
his two,
House.
yeah, he's brought his two sons into Crowded House, and it always made me think about Carl and the CP Express and how he'd done the same thing, you know, 30 years earlier, and it's really it creates a really different bond in some ways. The musical relationship, the relationship of a band is sort of different to the relationship of a father and son, but he sort of got the best of both worlds. And by
Yeah.
this time, he'd walk on stage. All he had to do was walk on stage, and people would jump out of their seats and start screaming and applauding. And he must have felt incredibly proud to have his sons experience that too. It must have been a really big moment for him.
Yeah, you talk about a musician for life. He played right up until only till like a few months before he passed in January of 98. And in November of 97, he was at a 100th birthday celebration for a fellow church member, right? And he played
Down
a
at
song for her at her table.
the
He's
Suede restaurant in Jackson, yeah, which
yeah,
as family Perkins family enterprise, yeah, and hey, it's your 100th birthday. Let me play you a song, and he died not long after. But the
that's
last big gig he did was only a few months before. It was a concert, a fundraiser for Montserrat, where Air Studios was, where Carl had gone to record with Paul McCartney, and so and this was in London, and again, Carl's brought out, and people just go mad. There's the
yeah.
bill with all these huge stars, particularly McCartney on the bill. Nah, it's Carl Perkins, man. Everybody would come to see Carl.
You could see that as the ending of the film. That's it.
Oh yeah,
He finishes on top. And there's a
yeah, he really
quote,
does. Yeah,
or there's actually a plaque on his wall with a quote on it. I wanted to read it because it says, just before his death, Carl had been asked how he would like to be remembered. So he looked up on the wall of his home in Jackson and it read, Within these walls, I've written my songs. I've done you right and I've done you wrong. Let it be said when I'm gone that he smiled and wasn't ashamed to play. A very fitting epitaph, as you write there. Yeah.
Not bad. Yeah, he wrote it. I mean, he did my work for me.
Yeah, yeah. What do you think his legacy? How do you remember him? How should he be remembered?
I mean, the simple fact that we're still talking about him, what, almost 25 years after his death, that's a lot. But a lot of the bands that, like the forward from Slim Jim Phantom, from the Stray Cats, really, I think it really captures the relationship that these younger guys, and there's a great band here called The Living End, who are really carrying that rockabilly spirit through, that Carl had created, with his brothers, and then later on his solo work. So I think there's that. Just the simple fact that um, he's talked about in the same breath as Elvis and Johnny Cash, Jerry Lee Lewis. The Million Dollar Quartet has seemed to have got another life of its own. I think there was a Broadway production, and Carl was such a big part of that. In fact, the Million Dollar Quartet session came out of a Carl Perkins session for Matchbox. So, just historical stuff like that, but also the fact that, a lot of young players, rockabilly seems to undergo frequent revivals. It's like every 10 or 15 years, suddenly rockabilly's back in fashion. And they're always citing Carl as number one, touchstone number one. If there's a if there's a rockabilly Mount Rushmore, Carl's face is dead center.
The King
And
of Rockabilly, just like it
King of
says on the.
Rockabilly. Yeah, again, I didn't have to work too hard to come up with that title. I can
No,
tell you.
man, that's just that came right at you. Yeah, Carl Perkins, the King of Rockabilly. It's out November 26th. You can find it wherever books are sold, and people can find you online. You have your own website, right, Jeff?
jeffapter.com.au, you'll find me. Yep, there's info about the book there. And yeah, look, advance reviews for the book have been fantastic. But I was just chuffed to get Slim Jim Phantom from the Stray Cats to write the foreword. He loved the book. And he just wrote this great, just about working with Carl. He called him a rockabilly Buddha. And I thought,
Yeah.
bad. That's not bad. That's a t-shirt, man.
Jeff Apter, thanks so much for coming on to talk about the book.
Great to talk to you again, Eric. Thanks very much.